Welcome to Unadulterated Adultery Confessions. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, my hands fumbling with the delicate straps of my summer dress. The late afternoon sun poured through the blinds, streaking the room with golden light. But my mind was elsewhere. I had just finished setting the table for dinner, waiting for him to come inside from the garden, where he was fixing the broken trellis, a chore he had taken on without me even asking. As I pulled one strap back over my shoulder, adjusting my bra underneath, my fingers, nimble in most situations, felt clumsy as I wrestled with the small clasp. Then, just as I thought I had it, the clasp securing my other strap came undone. The dress slipped. For a fleeting moment, I stood frozen in surprise, staring at my reflection as the fabric pulled at my waist, leaving me in nothing but lace and the glow of the sun. It was in that moment, just as I reached to pull the dress back up, that I heard it. A soft knock on the doorframe. "Dinner smells amazing. Do you need—" I turned sharply, clutching the dress against me. There stood my stepson, framed by the doorway. Jason's gaze lingered for a second too long before he realized and quickly turned his head. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice tight and hurried, like he'd forgotten how to breathe. "I didn't mean to—" "It's fine," I cut him off, though the heat rising to my cheeks betrayed my calm tone. "The door must have been ajar." He nodded, backing away as if the air between us had grown too charged. His eyes flickered up once to meet mine before he disappeared down the hall. I stood there for a moment, gripping the fabric of my dress, staring at the empty doorway, my heart pounding in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. I'm 52, a widow for nearly 5 years now, living in this sprawling house that feels too big and too quiet for just me. My late husband, Jason, left me with everything I needed: comfort, security, the kind of life most people dream of. But he also left me with an emptiness I hadn't anticipated, one that seemed to echo in every room and every mundane task. And then there's Ben, Jason's son from his first marriage. He's 27 now, tall, with a quiet confidence that's both endearing and maddening. When Jason passed, Ben insisted on staying in my life. "Family doesn't just stop," he had said at the funeral, his hand warm on mine, his grief mirroring my own. Over the years, he's been my lifeline in ways I didn't expect, coming over to help with the things Jason would have done, fixing the fence, clearing the gutters, carrying heavy boxes up from the basement. We fell into an easy rhythm, one where his company feels more like a balm for the loneliness I try so hard to hide. But lately, I've noticed something. It's in the way his eyes linger a second too long when I hand him a glass of iced tea. The way he stands a little closer than necessary when we're looking over old family photo albums. I've tried to dismiss it as my imagination, chalking it up to the way grief plays tricks on a lonely heart. But after what just happened, after the way his voice hitched and his cheeks flushed, I'm not so sure anymore. That night at dinner, the air between us was thick with something unspoken. He sat across from me, his sleeves rolled up, his tan forearms resting casually on the edge of the table as he complimented the roast chicken I had made. I smiled, nodding at his words, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the moment in the doorway, the way his eyes had widened before he quickly looked away, like he'd seen something he shouldn't have, like he wanted to look longer but knew he couldn't. The thing is, I wasn't as angry as I should have been. As I should have been, shouldn't I? I should have felt outraged or embarrassed or something closer to the kind of indignation a woman in my position is supposed to feel. But instead, there was only a strange, unwelcome heat curling in my chest, spreading to places I hadn't thought about in years. As I sipped my wine, I caught him glancing at me, his eyes dropping quickly to his plate when I met his gaze. For the first time, I felt something shift. It wasn't just me noticing him, it was him noticing me. After dinner, he offered to wash the dishes. I watched him from the living room, the steady rhythm of water running and plates clinking lulling me into a trance. His broad shoulders moved under his t-shirt as he leaned forward over the sink, and for a moment, I forgot myself. I forgot that I'm the woman who raised him. I forgot the decades between us. I forgot that this was wrong. When he turned off the faucet and looked over at me, his lips parted. My heart stuttered, and I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The following morning, I stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into my favorite ceramic mug, when I heard the sound of the back door creaking open. "Morning," Ben called out, his voice slightly hoarse, carrying the timbre of someone who hadn't quite shaken off sleep. I glanced over my shoulder, catching sight of him standing in the doorway. His hair was tousled, his t-shirt snug against his chest, and he held a toolbox in one hand. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady even though my pulse quickened. "Figured I'd get started on the back fence before it gets too hot," he said, stepping inside. His presence filled the room, the faint scent of earth and pine clinging to him. "Coffee?" I asked, holding up the pot. He smiled, that lopsided grin that always seemed to disarm me. "Sure, black, please." As I handed him the mug, his fingers brushed mine, just for a second, but long enough to send a ripple of awareness through me. I looked up, and our eyes met. It was fleeting, that moment, but it lingered in the charged air between us. The day unfolded in fragments of moments like that. Later, as I stood on the porch watching him hammer nails into the fence, I found myself studying him. His broad shoulders, the way his muscles flexed as he worked, the streak of sweat glistening at his temple. I scolded myself for looking, for allowing my mind to wander where it shouldn't. But it was hard to ignore the way he carried himself, that quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from him. At one point, he glanced back over his shoulder and caught me staring. I quickly turned away, pretending to adjust the hem of my sundress. But my heart thudded against my ribs. When he finished, I brought out a pitcher of lemonade. He sat on the porch steps, his hair damp and clinging to his skin, and I joined him, handing him a glass. "Looks like you fixed it," I said, nodding to the fence. "Only because I had such a good excuse to come over," he replied, his tone playful, but his eyes searching mine. I laughed softly, but his words lingered. I could feel the weight of them, the unspoken meaning hanging in the air. That night, I found myself tossing and turning in bed, my mind replaying every interaction from the day. His voice, his smile, the way his eyes had lingered. It all felt too vivid, too real to ignore. I tried to convince myself that it was harmless, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. A few days later, he stopped by again. "I thought I'd take a look at the deck," he said, standing in the doorway with that familiar toolbox in hand. The deck didn't need fixing. I knew it, and I was pretty sure he did too. But I stepped aside, letting him in. As he worked, I brought out a tray of iced tea. The summer heat was oppressive, and the cool drink was a welcome reprieve. He thanked me, taking a long sip, then leaned against the railing, his gaze drifting toward me. "You know," he began, his voice low, "I think this is the first summer I've really spent time here, with you." I smiled, feeling a warmth bloom in my chest. "I'm glad you're here, Ben. I really am." His eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Over the next few weeks, his visits became more frequent. He found reasons to be around, fixing a squeaky door hinge, replacing a light bulb, trimming the hedges in the garden. Each time, our conversations grew deeper, more personal. He told me about his childhood, about how he used to resent his father for remarrying so quickly after his mother left. But then he smiled, looking at me. "It didn't take long for me to realize how lucky he was to have found you." His words caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. But then he reached out, brushing his hand against mine, and everything else seemed to melt away. One evening, we sat on the porch swing, a bottle of wine between us. The conversation was light at first, memories of Jason, stories about Ben's college days. But as the wine flowed, so did the words we'd both been holding back. "I never told you this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But after Dad passed, I didn't just come around to help you. I came because I needed to be here, with you." His confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "Ben, I began, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "I know it's wrong," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I know how this looks, but I can't ignore what I feel." The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. He had come over to bring me a new garden hose, but the weather had taken a sudden turn, leaving us stranded indoors. The rain battered against the windows, the grey light casting long shadows across the living room. We sat on the couch, a movie playing softly in the background. I couldn't tell you what it was. We weren't paying attention. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the silence. "About what?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "About us." My heart skipped a beat. "Ben, we can't," I began, but he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "We're not hurting anyone. It's just us here, in this moment. Why can't we have that?" His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to argue, to push him away. But the truth was, I couldn't, because deep down, I wanted it too. Before I could say anything, he leaned in, his hand cupping my face as his lips brushed against mine. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he were waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, the world fell away. There was no rain, no judgment, no past or future. There was only us. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I couldn't stop myself." I shook my head, my hands trembling as they rested against his chest. "Don't be." We sat there for a long time, the rain continuing its relentless song on the world outside. Neither of us spoke, but the silence was filled with an understanding that didn't need words. By the time the rain stopped, something between us had shifted. There was no going back now. The next evening, Ben came over again, unannounced. It was unusual, even for him. I had barely had time to process what had happened between us the day before, and seeing him there, a determined look in his eyes, made my pulse quicken. "I needed to see you," he said simply, his voice steady yet edged with something raw. I hesitated, my hand lingering on the doorframe. "Ben, maybe we should talk about—" He stepped closer, closing the space between us. "We've been avoiding this, haven't we? For weeks, for months, and I think we both know where this is going." I wanted to argue, to push him away, to tell him this was wrong, but as I stood there, his words hung in the air, undeniable and heavy with truth. "Let me in," he said softly. His tone wasn't commanding, it was pleading, and I found myself stepping aside, letting him in, not just through the door, but into the guarded part of my heart I had tried so hard to keep locked away.